This presentation, I'm going to look at the Revolutionary War service of my patriot ancestor, John Hagey. I know specifically he was at Valley Forge in 1777 with General Lafayette. Later, he was at the Battle of Yorktown. And so I'm going to talk about his service. I'm going to talk about some of the documents I used to prove my lineage. And then I'm going to end up talking about Lafayette's Grand Tour of America, 1824 to 1825. So what got me started in all this was in 2011, my mother moved out of a condo in Kirkwood, Missouri, into Aberdeen Heights in Kirkwood, a continuing care retirement community. And the lady helping her clean out her storage unit found a family Bible in there of her great-grandfather, of William R. Brown. William R. Brown, turns out, was a colonel in charge of the 56th Illinois Infantry during the Civil War. And she was into genealogy. She found a biography of William R. Brown on genealogy trails for Massac County, Illinois. That biography referenced his wife's grandfather, John Hagey, and that's the first time I'd ever heard of John Hagey. One of the first things I did, I went to find a grave, and I found John Hagey's gravestone. There's a copy of it over here. It's the most unusual gravestone I think I've ever seen because it's got the man's life story on it. And part of that story talks about him coming with the Lafayette in 1777 into South Carolina. Looks like the computer's finally, I don't know what it's doing, but hopefully it'll be here in a minute. When I discovered this tombstone, I couldn't believe it. And it's one of those things, you see this and you get goosebumps and your eyes kind of tear up. I had to get on the phone with my younger brother who was in California at the time, and you're not going to believe what I found. Because here it finally is. Take me a minute to get it set up here. I'd like to show some of the images here of the actual documents and other items. Had this working before, but it's going to take a minute to pull up PowerPoint now. Sorry for the delay. The finding John Hagey was really the inspiration for me to join SAR and do all this research. And I would say that by the time I had been researching my genealogy on and off for about 15 years before that I discovered John Hagey. So I already had a lot of documents, and stuff your genealogist would want me to have, like my birth certificate that named my parents John Hundley Jr. and his wife Shirley Conrad. I had their marriage license. I had my mother's birth certificate, my father's birth certificate. I had my grandparents, Norman Conrad and Kitty McCarty. I had their marriage certificate from East St. Louis, Illinois. So hopefully this is going to come up. It's going to take it a minute. Proving lineage is something that requires a lot of documentation, and I'm sure your genealogist will tell you that. Hopefully that's up there. Okay, good. Let me turn this thing on so I can move it remotely. that went. I've already told you a few things about me. I mentioned I had 42 Revolutionary War Patriot ancestors. 12 of those had no prior record with either SAR or DAR. So my application was actually the first. This is a list of my 42 Patriot ancestors. This presentation I'm going to focus on two of them, John Hagey and also Michael Alt. I've already kind of outlined what I'm going to talk about here, so we'll move on. This was the thing that really got me going, and as I was describing, this is a long list of all the many documents I had to prove, in essence, get to William R. Brown. Kind of stuff. This is actually an image from the family Bible. There were actually 4 different generations named in the family Bible of William R. Brown. He recorded his parents, he recorded his wife's parents. This is just, by the way, the birth register. Most family Bibles are going to have a birth register, a deaths register, a marriage register. The birth register here had 4 generations. This is what was on the genealogy trails in Madison County, Illinois. And a little bit about William R. Brown. He's an interesting character. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1832, married a Margaret A. Thrift in Livingston, Kentucky. Was a banker. He was a member of the 27th Illinois General Assembly. He was a Republican politician that supported Abraham Lincoln. And he died in East St. Louis, Illinois in 1905 and is buried in the Masonic Cemetery in Metropolis, Illinois. This is just a record of his marriage to Margaret Thrift in Livingston, Kentucky. This is from the FamilySearch.org, and they actually had an actual image of the marriage register. I had a census record for Margaret Thrift at age 12 in the household of her parents. Margaret, by the way, is her mother, Margaret Hagey, and Barrick O. Thrift in Kentucky. So I had a number of things that proved that Margaret Thrift Brown was the daughter of B.O. Thrift and Margaret Hagey Thrift. And as I said, this kind of inspired me to keep researching. This is actually from the Chicago Biographic Publishing Company, where it gives information on John Hagey. This is how I first discovered John Hagey. So John Hagey, grandfather of Mrs. Brown, was born in Germany, went from there to France where he joined Lafayette as one of his bodyguard, came with him to America, and it talks about at the time of General Lafayette's visit to America in 1825, John Hagey at age 77 walked 100 miles from Huntsville, Alabama to Nashville to greet the general. And that story's in several different newspaper articles that I'll highlight. This is the tombstone of John Hagey. I got a photo of it here, but I can tell you I've never seen a tombstone that looks like that. It's got the man's life story on it. It talks about him coming into with the general in 1777. Talks about being at the siege of Yorktown. Talks about him greeting the general. John Hagey was born in Strasbourg, Alsace. That's a part of Europe that's gone back and forth between France and Germany. You're going to see him referenced as a German, but you know, in 1748 when he was born, Germany wasn't a country. Germany didn't become a country till over 100 years later. He's referred to as a German, I think, because he's German speaking. And he joined Lafayette, arrived in Georgetown in 1777, was selected as one of his lifeguards. He later served in the French Light Horse and was at Yorktown and witnessed the British surrender on the 19th of October, 1781. He stayed in America after the Revolution and became a U.S. citizen and married a Catherine Alt. There was a prior DAR record for John Hagey, but not going through his daughter, Margaret. And so he was already established as a patriot in the lineage organizations. This is from the Valley Forge muster roll. I don't know if anyone's looked up people there, but here's John Hagey on the Valley Forge muster roll. He's described as aide-de-camp, and he's described as served as a member of General Lafayette's private guard. In other words, he was an employee of the general. The next muster roll entry is that of Lafayette himself. There were about 30 French soldiers at Valley Forge, and from December 1777 until June of 1778. What's significant about Lafayette is that in January, when you read through this, January 1779, Lafayette returned to France to raise more resources to help with the American Revolution. And we did get additional French support. In July 1780, 5,500 French troops under the command of General Rochambeau came into Rhode Island. I believe John Hagey went back with the general to France and then returned with Rochambeau. In several places, John Hagey refers to coming over in 1777 with the general. And then another deposition, he talks about coming into Rhode Island with the French Light Horse. So my sense is that he went back to France and then returned. Both General Washington and General Rochambeau requested the assistance of the French fleet under the command of an Admiral de Grasse. De Grasse decided to sail to Chesapeake Bay and blockade the fortifications, British fortifications of Yorktown. Washington was a very clever guy, and he sent out a lot of false dispatches trying to get the British to believe he was headed north to New York when he actually was headed south to Yorktown. The siege of Yorktown began with a blockade by the French fleet. That blockade kept the British from bringing in reinforcements from New York. It kept them from retreating. In effect, they were trapped in Yorktown. And on August 28, 1781, General Washington had the French and American troops deployed to surround the British. And then they had their artillery pummeling the British. They were just pounding them. Here's a battle map of Yorktown. And you can see in the York River, the French fleet there blocking the British fortifications. You can see are on both sides of the river. And they had some outer fortifications called redoubts. The French and Rochambeau had 8,800 troops. General Washington and the American lines had over 11,000 troops. That included about 3,000 militia at Yorktown. By the way, General Lafayette was with General Washington in the American lines. The British had 9,000 troops. When I looked at where different units were stationed, the French light horse and the officers that John Hagey served under were actually up on the other side of the river. And October 14, 1781, the French stormed Redoubt 9 and the Americans stormed Redoubt 10. With the capture of these outer defenses, both the British and the French moved in their artillery closer and closer to the British, where they just were pounding. The situation for the British at this point was hopeless. They really had no choice but to surrender. Here's some art depicting the storming of Redoubt 10. And it gives you a flavor of what was going on there. Here's another picture of the siege of Yorktown that's part of the American military archives. I'm going to talk a little bit about the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cornwallis actually refused to meet with Washington. He claimed he was sick and he couldn't be there. He sent his second in command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, who presented the sword of surrender to Rochambeau. Rochambeau shook his head and pointed to Washington. Washington shook his head and pointed at his second in command, Benjamin Lincoln, who had been humiliated earlier by the British in South Carolina. The British soldiers marched out and laid their arms down between the French on one side and the British on the other. And to me, the most significant thing here is those 9,000 troops that just surrendered, that was 1/4 of all the British troops in America. That was a catastrophic loss. They lost 1/4 of their army. And Yorktown was the last major battle of the American Revolution and prompted the British to negotiate a settlement. Here's art depicting, art by John Trumbull depicting the surrender at Yorktown. You got the French on the left, the Americans on the right, and the British coming in the center laying down their arms. Anyway, after learning about all this, then I found John Hagey at age 77 had walked 100 miles from Huntsville to Nashville to greet Lafayette on the Lafayette's Grand Tour. And Lafayette apparently immediately recognized John Hagey and said, "John, is that you?" And when John Hagey died in 1841, 5,000 people lined the streets of Nashville for this man's funeral. You know, the average number of people at a funeral is 200. So this man was considered very special by the people of Nashville. And so this is where I started getting more documents to prove my lineage. And I did this fairly cheaply. I got a hold of Metro Archives in Nashville, and they made copies of several documents for me, including the marriage register and marriage bonds of B.O. Thrift and Margaret Hagey, and the 1861 obituary for Catherine Alt Hagey, who at age 106 was the oldest living resident of the state of Tennessee. There's the marriage register, and then the marriage bonds that just showed Margaret Hagey had married B.O. Thrift, and then the obituary of Catherine Alt Hagey, again, the oldest inhabitant in the state of Tennessee at the time, and it references the widow of John Hagey, who had come to America with Lafayette. And I actually, the 1860 census, Catherine Hagey is in there, living in the household of her daughter, Susan Martin. And by golly, it does show she was 106 in the census record. One of the things I found was Catherine Alt Hagey's Find a Grave Memorial. And fortunately, someone had linked her Find a Grave Memorial to that of her father, Michael, which was significant. I had one of the documents I had a book on the Hagey families in America, and I'm sure that your genealogist will confirm this. We were using a family history book. What's really critical is the annotation. What sources did the author use for the information in that book? And I was a little leery, to tell you the truth, because I didn't see enough annotation to tell me where the author of the book got the information. He had messed up some information, like Catherine Alt's name was spelled A-U-L-T, not H-U-L-T, and he got Appleby Thrift's name mixed up and misspelled. So that told me that was probably based on oral tradition rather than actual primary documents. Here was the book on the Hagey families in America, the Delaney family. And it's Hagey families. That book actually had 14 different Hagey families that had come to America. Most of them were Swiss German. This happens to be the chapter on John Hagey, one of 14 Hagey families that came over. And it gives most of the information that I've already described. It did list the children of John Hagey and Catherine Alt, and including Margaret. One of the things I found is that there was also a book on Michael Alt. Michael Alt, a Revolutionary soldier, interestingly enough, who that also included a list of the children of John Hagey and Catherine Alt Hagey. But the author there reports the source was an affidavit given in 1859 as part of a Revolutionary War pension application. So it was an affidavit by the John Hagey's son, John Hagey Jr., who named the other children in the family. Here's the library information on that book. This, by the way, these are from the Allen County Public Library. When I lived in Indiana, I was 2 hours away from Fort Wayne. And the Allen County Public Library is considered the second best genealogical library in America. So I was lucky enough to live close to a gold mine of information. A little bit about Patriot Michael Alt. He left Germany and sailed from Holland to Philadelphia. I actually have a copy of the ship's record of him arriving at age 16, and from the best I could tell, he came alone. To me, yeah, at age 16, traveling to another country where you don't speak the language, and wow. He served as a private in the Northumberland, Pennsylvania militia, and what interested me, he's one of 4 of my Patriot ancestors where there's 7 different surnames involved. That's highly unusual, I would think, because it goes from Alt to Hagey to Thrift to Brown to McCarty to Conrad to Hundley in terms of surnames. And every time a surname changes, you really need to prove that difference. Here's the affidavit that John Hagey Jr. gave in 1859. And again, he does name his sister Margaret, who married Ogilvy Thrift. This John Hagey, the Revolutionary War pension file for John Hagey is filled with correspondence from John Hagey Jr. It was, as you'll see, it's a rejected pension file. But one of the other documents I got from Knox County, Tennessee, for a total of $2.60, they charged me for a copy of the will of Michael Alt that named his son-in-law John Hagey. Named several of his sons-in-law. There's an actual copy of the will naming sons-in-law, and So I felt I had a number of, I actually wrote a genealogical proof argument that Margaret was the daughter of John Hagey, and I thought I had a fair amount of information to prove that. This is a Revolutionary War pension application of John Hagey. What's interesting here in this affidavit is where he talks about coming into Rhode Island, whereas some of his other statements refer to coming in to South Carolina with Lafayette. John Hagey's pension application was rejected. And you can see the reason they gave: belonging to the Army of France is not provided for in the Act of June 1832. To qualify for a pension, Revolutionary War pension, you had to be under the command of American officers and on the payroll of an American unit. John Hagey was under the command of General Lafayette and French officers and on the French payroll. Therefore, he didn't qualify. And that's just the cover of his pension jacket, where it was, written right across, belonging to the Army of France. He was just rejected pension. So, the case of John Hagey's pension actually made it to the United States Senate. This is a United States Senate committee report from May 1860. The United States Senate Committee on Pensions. And in essence, John Hagey Jr. was very prolific at writing letters to politicians trying to get this pension money for his mother, which he never got. But it actually went to a Senate committee, and the bottom line of this report, what it says, is that the United States does not provide pensions for soldiers of its allies. And that's true today. For example, we're not providing pensions for soldiers of the South Vietnamese Army, just as an example. So I found that very interesting that it got all the way to the United States Senate. Anyway, bottom line, I was able to prove supplemental application for John Hagey. Now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about Lafayette's Grand Tour of America, which President James Monroe, in consultation with Congress, invited Lafayette. And so from July of 1824 through September 1825, Lafayette toured 24 states in the United States of America. And while I was here, several people painted his portrait. Here's one of Lafayette's portraits from the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. This one's painted by a painter, Samuel F.B. Morse, who's probably better known for something other than being a painter. A trivia question, anybody know what that might be?
Telegraph.
Pardon me?
Is it telegraph?
Code.
Telegraph and Morse code. So he was a painter, but he also did some other things. Interesting enough, one of the other portraits painted while Lafayette was in America hangs in the United States House of Representatives. There are only two portraits hanging in our United States House of Representatives. One is George Washington, the other is General Lafayette. As I said, I lived in South Bend, Indiana for about 24 years before I moved back to St. Louis. One of the items in the Studebaker Museum in South Bend is General Lafayette's carriage from the Grand Tour 1824 to 1825. The Studebaker Museum actually has a collection of presidential carriages, including those of Lincoln, Grant, and McKinley. Here's another view of that carriage. And the carriage was built in Baltimore. It was purchased by Clement Studebaker to put on display, and the Studebaker wagon. Studebaker, by the way, is one of the only wagon maker that transitioned from making wagons to automobiles, interesting enough. It's the oldest vehicle in the Studebaker National Museum. Great museum if you ever travel to South Bend, it's well worth visiting. Lafayette was accompanied on this grand tour by a writer, Auguste Levasseur, who published a book in 1829. And in that book, Levasseur describes Lafayette being greeted by John Hagey. And there are other references to it. Here's one from Alabama, State of Alabama Archives. Here's an article from the Nashville Whig. It doesn't name John Hagey directly, but it describes what happened when he was greeted by this German guy. Here's an obituary of John Hagey from 1841. Again, references Lafayette. Here's another obituary. What I found interesting in this one is that it does say was attended by an immense concourse of about 5,000 people. I found the 5,000 number to be somewhat fantastic, but it looks like this newspaper report says it was in that neighborhood. As I kind of draw to an end, one of the questions that I had was, did Lafayette come to Missouri? The answer is yes. Actually, about a week before he was in Nashville, he was in St. Louis, and here's a piece of art by artist John Heller that kind of portrays Lafayette visiting at the home of Pierre Choteau. And there's some other, there was an article in the Post-Dispatch kind of looking back at the visit. Actually, Lafayette stopped in Carondelet first, spent the night there, and then they sailed for an hour or two in the morning and then landed in St. Louis. What interested me here is St. Louis at that time was a frontier outpost of perhaps 12,000 people at that time. And that was as deep as Lafayette ventured into the American wilderness. This Auguste Levasseur also described Lafayette's visit to St. Louis. It's in his book. And being greeted by Mayor William Carr Lane, and that's kind of the end of it. So hopefully there's some, interesting information there. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.